Right, this last video in our first series of 3 is going to be a little bit longer, but I'm going to try and keep it pretty tight because we're looking at the main perspectives in sociology. One of the things that makes sociology different from a lot of the hard sciences and even some of the other social sciences is that there's not just one way of thinking about society. There are different fundamental perspectives or kind of toolboxes for thinking about society. And while sometimes these can be in conflict with one another, we'll see that they don't necessarily have to be. But this does make for a diversity of ideas and viewpoints in sociology that makes it a little bit different from people who all agree on what a gas or what a particle is in the hard sciences as they're known. So we can think of these different perspectives as different ideas about what society is. If you want to go out in the world and empirically measure a gas, you have to know what a gas is. And people generally agree on that. But people have different ideas about what society is. How do we think about society itself? And I like to think of these as toolboxes or really as windows. If you think about a house, any given window in the house, you go in, you look, you move around the house, you're going to see something different. You look in the living room, you see how people greet strangers or friends and interact with them and the norms around that. Then you go to the bedroom and you see perhaps other things they do with friends and strangers. And then you go to the bathroom and you can view their habits around grooming and being clean. In the same way that these different windows together can give us a more complete picture, these different ideas about society, different ways of looking in on society, can give us different ideas about what society is. So each of these has fundamentally different assumptions. And we need these assumptions to kind of go out there and do the science. If we don't know what society is, how can we study it? Right? So each assumes society is something different. But we can also think of them as kind of complementary lenses, complementary windows into society. When we look at these different viewpoints, we get maybe a more complete picture. So the everyday view of society is what we call kind of the sum of its parts. There's just a bunch of people making choices out there. We all want to do well and eat well and get money. And society is really just kind of built up of all of us doing our own thing kind of at the same time, the sum of the parts. In this view, society isn't really anything. And this is kind of the view behind one of the key perspectives, which is rational choice theory. Again, this is just society is just made up of individuals, and in particular that people make kind of cost-benefit or rational choices in every action they do. When you get in the car, the cost and benefit of taking an umbrella, the cost and benefit of different routes to work, the cost and benefit, and so on. The fundamental question here is, what does the individual or organization gain? What do they lose? What's the trade-off? So if we want to go with a kind of a continual idea about why do people wear masks and not wear masks in our society, from the rational choice perspective, they would ask, what is the trade-off here? So if the action is to wear a mask, the benefit is you don't transmit droplets via your mouth, and you could stop some droplets from other people's mouths coming at you. So you're not transmitting a deadly disease, which is super. What's the main cost to you? What do you lose? Well, your face gets a little moist. Versus don't wearing a mask. The benefit, I guess your face is less moist. The cost, you could spread COVID more easily and catch it more easily. None of us really wants to kill people, so we think it'd be obvious everybody should wear a mask. But this isn't what people do. People don't really make rational decisions, which is why we don't really use this a lot in my class. We're not really rational creatures. We need to build habits around it. We're just not used to wearing masks. We forget them. They feel uncomfortable. We're not used to them. And they've also become politicized. We've transmitted bad messaging around masks. So rational choice theory is useful in some situations where we actually do have to make cost-benefit analyses. But in truth, we're not really very rational creatures, though we like to think that we are, and we often tell ourselves we are. So another perspective is structural functionalism. The assumption here is that society operates like a more or less complex organism. Worms are pretty simple. Human bodies are much more complex. Societies, they argue, are the same way. And so in this perspective, we look at different institutions and different aspects of society. This is kind of a very upper level view. We're kind of a bird's eye view. And asking, how does this thing function or dysfunction to make society work as a body? Right? So if we think about the education system and the family and the healthcare system, all of these have different functions. And as long as the families are teaching kids and feeding them, and the education system is educating them, then everything works smoothly together. So if we go with this organic or organismic analogy, careful with that one, about society, how do we explain this whole mask issue? Well, some would have said in the media that it's a question of leadership and messaging. So we're looking at how different institutions or organizations are working, are functioning, or not functioning. So on the one hand, they said that the medical leaders and the medical institution, which is there to protect our public health, didn't consistently say, go wear masks. And so that was kind of a failure of leadership, but also political leadership. So the political system, which can mandate and tell people, wear a mask or don't wear a mask, has been very inconsistent. Some at the city level, for example, have said wear a mask, whereas the state in Georgia, they say don't wear a mask, or you should, but you don't have to. And so here we might ask, like, is this a breakdown of the institution? The effect of wearing a mask is clear and well known, so maybe it's these institutions that are kind of dysfunctioning. And this helps us because then we can say, okay, well, in the future, we need to be really clear about wearing masks and washing hands, and we can't kind of go back and forth on those issues because it confuses people. And we need more consistent and clear leadership. Right? So this is a very kind of prescriptive view of, how do we keep it from dysfunctioning in the future? How do we try to make it work right now? As you're joining pain right now, you might notice our own institution functioning and dysfunctioning. Again, we can look at why so many students aren't yet cleared for taking classes. And we say, well, they should have cleared financial aid before classes started, but they didn't. So you would think that next semester they would try to clear students before class starts. We'll see if they do. Conflict perspectives take, again, a different kind of approach. They assume that society isn't this kind of cohesive body. It's kind of we're all together working towards collective well-being, and that everything isn't really working well for everyone. Conflict perspectives say that there are different groups in society struggling over limited resources, particularly power, property, and prestige. So for example, men occupy most positions of leadership in our country, even though they're only half of the population. So men have that power and that prestige of being governors, of being mayors, of being president, and they don't want to give it up. They have 50%, they have way more than 50% of the pie, and women are asking for a bigger slice. The issue of reparations is about this, is about white folks own much more property in our society, and the idea of that they would have to repay that to another group would mean that white folks would supposedly lose out on some things they have, in this instance, property and often power. So depending on the different perspective, whether it's feminist or critical race theory or kind of Marxist theory, it's conflicts between classes or men and women, or between white folks and marginalized others. And from this perspective, the kind of questions we ask are often who benefits and whose interest does this work? Now, it might not seem like wearing masks and opening up businesses is in anyone's benefit during a pandemic. But if we think about business owners or capitalists, as Marx would call them, they've been losing out a ton because nobody's been doing business. They need the markets and jobs and people buying stuff. So if we think about some of these ideas about going back to school, going back to work, going back to bars, it's business owners, particularly these large businesses, that tend to benefit from this. That's whose interest is being served, the capitalist class. And so they treat the pandemic as though it's no big deal almost. Who loses out? Well, primarily the working class and primarily poor working people of color. So if we look at why would the state of Georgia reopen, but only reopen salons and theaters and hairstylists, for example. Well, the wealthier white people in society, they don't work in any of those places. They're mostly staffed by women of color. And so whose interest does it work in? Who loses out? Who benefits? And we assume that there's a conflict between groups, that not everything is working as it should. Lastly, we can look at symbolic interactionism, another kind of fancy name, but what it really means is we look at how do individuals between one another, using our symbols and our language, create meaning. How do we make sense of the world? How do we socially create our everyday world? This is a very local, kind of interactive perspective between individuals. And here's where we maybe see the most relevant view of masks, is masks have come to mean something other than just a thing on your face to keep droplets from spreading. For men, for example, men tend to wear masks less. Why? Well, because for men it's a symbol, or it means weakness, that they need protection in some way. For others, it's a symbol of the government imposing its will, its laws on people, so it's a symbol of a lack of freedom. We can look at how this messaging happened. We can see the leaders who transmitted it. We can listen and read through the speeches. We can analyze this in a scientific way. Right? So this is another systematic way of thinking about, how do we explain what's going on in our social world, and how did this meaning around masks come to be? So we can use all of these perspectives to look at these questions in society. We can look at the functional perspective and the symbolic interactionism, or the critical perspective as well. The meaning behind the mask comes from somewhere, from those people in power and the messaging they give. All of this has to do with the balance between our personal choices or our agency in the social structures and the dynamics around them. We make a choice about masks based on the meaning that comes from society, the meaning around us, which is related to the social groups and political parties we're in. So these are the fundamental perspectives. We'll revisit them as we go throughout, but they give us different windows to thinking about what society is and what social behavior means. We'll discuss this more in our in-person class section and really dig into each as a group.